One of the sort of frustrations that people have had with digital technology is that although it's resulted in productivity improvements, we still are working as many, if not more hours as we used to. And it hasn't freed us, from hard work on some level.
He's in his second stint at KPMG and very much at the forefront of the AI revolution. We attempt to unravel the layers and explore how generative AI is evolving and fostering a seamless human-machine collaboration. We delve into the ethical considerations, macro trends in AI that Paul is seeing, global adoption, and the gold rush for AI productization. And we also put a spotlight on the societal impact and possible job displacement, amongst other things. You really do want to miss this one. It's a great episode. It's Paul Henninger. Paul, thank you so much for coming on the Tech Leaders podcast. I'm really, really excited. Do you know what? This is the first time we've had a second guest from the same organization onto the show. So congratulations, you're a Tech Leaders podcast first. We had Lisa Henninger on probably about a year ago now, and this is the second person from the almighty KPMG, one of the most well-known global consultancy firms in the world. There's so much to talk about at the moment, Paul, with this explosion of artificial intelligence. But let's start with the immortal first question of the Tech Leaders podcast. What does good leadership mean to you, Paul?
It's a good question. I think what I've come to believe is that good leadership requires, as many things do, a strong and sometimes embarrassing sense of curiosity. I find it impossible to understand all of the details of the technology teams that I lead today. But I also find that I'm a much more effective leader when I am willing to ask them a bunch of stupid questions and then progressively slightly less or more interesting questions to understand enough about the problems that they're solving, the way the technologies work or don't work, such that I understand the context that they're operating in. Yeah, once I do that, then it's some of the usual things. I never ask anyone to do something I wouldn't be willing to do if I had time. And I think once I understand enough about what they're doing, it's a lot easier for me to give them the freedom and support and challenge that they need to do it really, really well. But the starting point is that curiosity about exactly what the heck it is that they're going through, struggling with, researching what's next for them. And once I understand that a little bit better, albeit not as well as they do, I find it decent leadership to be within grasp.
Yeah, for sure. I think retaining childlike curiosity as you get older and more experienced is quite a challenge, that is, isn't it? Because you kind of develop a bit of not an ego, but you feel like you shouldn't be curious anymore almost as you get older. But you need to, you definitely need to be, because if you're not and you become too proud to ask the stupid questions like you refer to there, then it probably has a detrimental effect on your own development and your own leadership skills, doesn't it? So tell us a bit about yourself, Paul, from point of graduating from Princeton all them years ago through to where you are today.
I got my first computer, or I got access to my first computer when I was 5 years old. So don't think anybody in my generation is considered a digital native in any technical sense, but I've been trying to learn how to code.
What computer was it?
It was a TRS-80, which was one of the first
nice.
Laptop-looking laptops, and my dad brought it home. And I don't actually remember where I got a book on basic programming, i.e. beginner's all-purpose symbolic instructional code, but I got one and started to write, the line 10 print Paul, line 20, go to 10, and then various other things from there. But I've been working with trying to make computers do something fun, I suppose, originally, and then interesting after that, and then useful after that for a long time. Ironically, though, I studied architecture, and sometimes I just leave that as a word, and people think it's network architecture or something like that. But it's the buildings.
The old-fashioned kind of architecture.
Yeah, exactly. And there was a project that I did, which is how I kind of got firmly ensconced in the world of data and analytics, and I suppose ultimately AI, where I and a couple friends took some video from closed-circuit televisions around the world, borrowed some software from a physics lab, converted the video into these particle flow models, and looked at the interactions between pedestrians and cars and other objects, and at the end kind of printed out the design for a funny-shaped park bench. And I remember there was a specific moment during that effort where I thought, that the technologies that underlie the design for our funny shaped park bench might have something more useful for the world to offer than park benches. Not to say I don't enjoy a good park bench. And so I sort of set off to try to find where I could learn more about that stuff and understand how it was going to impact the world, and ended up through a succession of software companies, including Fair Isaac, and have been working ever since then to try to learn more about what I think of as data-centric technologies, although most technologies these days are data-centric, and try to figure out what problems they might usefully be pointed at, try to assemble groups of people, usually with relatively diverse backgrounds in terms of how they think about things around those problems, and see if we can identify enough value that we could keep going with it. And some of that's gone really well, and some of it's, as you might imagine, been a few dead ends, and then 25 years of that, basically, more or less.
That's fantastic. So you were sort of playing around with things that would lead to AI, essentially. I don't know what you would call it in the early days. You were in there really, really early, I suppose, then, yeah?
One of the things that I ended up working on, this was about 14 or 15 years ago now, was using machine learning to do something which everyone's quite excited about now, 15 years later, which is to detect cancer or diagnose cancer from MRI images. And the interesting thing was from a technical point of view, I and the group of data scientists and engineers that worked on that at that time succeeded in producing a model that could identify a certain type of cancer as well, or I suppose more accurately, better than the panel of doctors that we were using to compare the results to. And it was an interesting failure, mainly because technically we succeeded. We got something that was right more often than people, but we hadn't thought a lot about the very human process that surrounded a cancer diagnosis, and kind of more to the point, the even more human process that surrounded not just the diagnosis, but the sort of entire experience that someone has from, something not feeling right to going to a medical professional and having a set of meetings or discussions, and then getting a diagnosis, and then in the sort of, worst case, going through a treatment and recovery and post-treatment and all sorts of other things. And there were two other projects that I'd been involved in the intervening years, which got better at understanding those very human problems and starting to think about how artificial intelligence got built into those human processes. One of the main lessons that I have from pretty much every advanced analytic project that I worked from is that although it's hard, the easy part is getting the analytics to work, and the hard part is thinking enough about, and in an innovative way, enough about all of the sort of, human decisions, human cycles, the speed at which humans interact, think, do their work, to figure out how the incredible speed with which a machine's capable of analysis can be synced up with a human process.
Yeah, fantastic. This episode is brought to you by Be Digital UK. Be Digital are a trusted partner to leadership teams of technology-driven organizations, delivering ROI-led solutions across cost optimization and also data and AI adoption. Looking back now over the course of your career, what were the key milestones, Paul, that you think set you on the path that you ended up pursuing? What kind of things stand out?
One of the key moments was literally physically moving, which was not a particularly digital experience. It involved lots of boxes and airplanes and things like that. I moved from New York City to London about 10 years ago, and it required that I not relearn, things. I knew how to make a sandwich. I knew how to, take the tube. I knew how to turn on the television and all sorts of other things. But it required that I, resync with a kind of culture and just a set of very subtle differences. And that was an opportunity for me to a little bit reevaluate some of the assumptions that I had that I didn't even realize that I had, I suppose, at the time. I had the observation at the time that the set of technologies that I worked with were advancing at a rate such that the problems that my customers or clients had and were bringing to me exceeded the rate at which I could respond to them, in any version of any software company, whether it was literally my own startup or very, very large companies I worked for. And so I partly, after that move to London, ended up working back in the consulting and or advisory industry, which, to my assessment was, the most logical place to lean into the proliferation of problems that we could potentially solve with, again, data-centric or other technologies. And so that was a critical moment. I did my own startup, which is to say it was, I was tied for employee number one with a friend of mine. That was a incredible experience. I mean, it was ultimately kind of successful in the end, in terms of how those things are measured. I thought I was willing to kind of do anything that needed to be done. I've always been one of those sort of, to the extent that I'm a leader, I'm definitely a servant leader. There isn't anything that's below me, even though I do know that there's better uses of my time and worse uses of my time. But when you literally are starting from an actual blank sheet of paper in terms of what problem you're going to solve, how you're going to approach solving it, how do you pay employees, where do you have an office? It was an incredibly formative experience, as well as the experience of not having any brand or brand permission at all. Working as I do now at KPMG, you can, people know who KPMG is. They don't wonder why we're there to talk to them. When I was at my startup, people knew who I was, and some of them were willing to talk to me, but they'd never heard of what we were doing or why we were doing it. It was relatively new and novel, and so it was a fascinating experience to have to think through, how do you connect with people with problems in a different way and think about how you can help them and get them to take a little bit of a bet on your ability to execute in a way that was different than anything that I'd experienced before.
Yeah, I think the selling part of it takes on a whole new challenge, doesn't it? Because nobody's ever heard of you. How did that startup situation, because you worked for a relatively stable company with a really good role. Was it Actimize?
Yeah.
You were the VP of products there, and then all of a sudden you start your own firm. I think around the sort of the time you were leaving, and then go it alone for the best part of 3 years.
Yeah.
How did that come about? Okay, and what were the key lessons apart from what you've mentioned? What were the key things you learned from that experience which stood you in better stead, obviously going into the role with BAE and beyond?
Like a lot of things in my life or in my work life, it did start from a kind of technical observation which stuck in my head, basically. Actimize was a company that developed analytical solutions to detect fraud, to combat money laundering, and to help firms with compliance problems in capital markets. And so we had some advanced analytics and some rule sets and all sorts of other things. And at the time, everyone was interested in the sort of problem of explainability, as they are today with AI. And the sort of perception was that sort of advanced analytics or machine learning was not explainable, whereas rules were. And so I had arguments with people to explain that rules were very explainable, but other things were equally as explainable. But my observation was that people were really, really into rules and had an idea about using complex analytics to break rule sets apart, optimize them, and then reassemble them as even better rule sets, basically. And so eventually did work with some folks to come up with a modified genetic algorithm-based approach to doing that. And so having identified a kind of literal solution in search of a problem, and having been convinced that the solution was interesting enough and applicable enough, also just ran into a kind of, a normal, cycle of personal achievement or whatever. We'd grown Actimize from a kind of 30-person company with a couple $1 million in revenue to a few 100-person company with a couple $100 million in revenue. And so it was just an interesting inflection point, and took the opportunity to take this technical idea we had and go in search of a couple problems to solve. Set up the company, and actually, interestingly, initially identified people analytics as a place to solve it, based on the observation that was the one area of a modern enterprise that in effect used almost no data or analytics to run things. But again, starting point, as it often is with me, even if I'm no longer the one writing any code, I get quite interested in the potential of technical ideas, whether they're big ideas or small ideas or simple ideas or complex ones or whatever. And my passion's always been, as it was, the beginning of my career, to see what can we find to do with this. And that was interesting enough to build a company around, in essence.
Yeah, sure. And you sell the company, I'm assuming, then?
We did, yeah. We actually sold it to a consulting firm. And actually, the story of my life is consulting firms trying to become software companies and software companies trying to become consulting companies. There's always, for whatever reason, it must be something about me, I've always managed to get involved in the tension between how do you take intellectual assets and form them into software of one type or another, or how do you take intellectual assets or technical assets and form them into the services that people need to make technology useful.
Obviously, you would expel at BAE, KPMG, you went to another consultant firm and then back to KPMG. So what made you go back? And tell us about your current role as head of Digital Lighthouse and what exactly that means.
KPMG I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but I came back to KPMG for the people and the culture. The thing that had attracted to me the first time around had been a group of people that I knew who started working there. And the thing I loved about it was the way in which collaboration wasn't just a kind of hard to argue with way to get things done, but was part of the literal DNA of the organization. That was why I came back, and it's one of the things that makes me excited to come in to the office or to press a button in my home office and become part of work every morning, as we do these days. In my role leading Digital Lighthouse globally, on some level, Digital Lighthouse is something very simple, which is it's the Global AI Analytics and Emerging Technology Center of Excellence. And what we do in that regard is connect, set the strategy for and help build capability around the world for KPMG in those areas, AI and analytics being relatively straightforward technical domains, albeit ones that everybody is interested in these days in a relatively intense way, and emerging tech being a relatively constantly shifting things. Stuff we're focused on these days are things like quantum and even still the metaverse, despite the slight drift in people's interest in that. But what we found over the years is that the capabilities that you need to make those things useful are more than just AI and analytics. And so we started delivery networks around cloud and testing and automation and all the technologies that need to be assembled to deploy analytics, into the real world, into a business, into a government agency or department or ministry to solve a real problem. And ultimately, what we noticed on some level that we'd gotten good at was building digital things, whether they're products or solutions or assets that consultants use to do the work that they do. And so in some respects, Global Lighthouse are the sort of digital builders of KPMG, who partner with all sorts of parts of the firm, definitely in consulting and advisory, but equally in tax and audit, to figure out, which of the technologies with which alliance partners and what configurations can be brought to bear on how we solve problems for our clients across domains from, financial crime to internal audit, to global business services and finance to slightly more arcane, model risk problems in capital markets and all kinds of things. It ends up being the thing that I've looked for, my whole career, which is the opportunity to assemble an incredible expert team, in this case, distributed around the world on a set of really interesting technologies, but do so only in the service of working closely with, people with domain expertise in some, specific part of a business problem or operational problem or process problem or whatever, and figuring out together how we might build something that can solve that better, faster, cheaper, or in a new way.
Fantastic. Okay, so thanks for clearing that up. I think it was quite an interesting job title, so I wasn't sure what was meant by that, but that makes total sense. So let's talk about AI, Paul. I think we were all quite blown away with ChatGPT around about this time last year, and since then it seems to be growing and going from strength to strength in terms of these large language models. And it felt like AI capability had finally come to the masses, didn't it, with ChatGPT? But there's use cases popping up everywhere. There's tools popping up everywhere. There are concerns, and maybe justified concerns, about AI displacing jobs. In your view, does AI primarily lead to job displacement, or do you see it as a tool that can also be used to create jobs?
I see AI as fundamentally a transformation technology or transformative technology, because I do think, mainly because I've seen the impact it can have when it's configured and deployed in the right way. It can fundamentally change how we do something, whether it's prepare an argument in the context of a litigation, whether it's conduct a sanctions monitorship, whether it's price an ad block or something like that. And I do think that there are decisions. One of the things that AI introduces is significant productivity, although it's not the only thing. And when you're able to generate dramatic productivity improvements, a 3 or 5% productivity improvement is dramatic enough. If you look at the sort of estimates that we've done and that others have done, over the impact that AI could have from a productivity point of view over the next 5 to 10 years, you're well into the sort of, 15, 20% impact. And when that happens, we have a decision to make, as you do with any kind of productivity improvement. And that is whether we do more with the sort of labor that we've got, or whether we decide to sort of pack it in and kind of keep the same amount of output and problem solving, with fewer people, which would mean there would be displacement of the actual people doing work. And I think what's more likely is that AI will stimulate the type of growth that we've seen in places like the internet. I mean, one of the sort of frustrations that people have had with digital technology is that although it's resulted in productivity improvements, we still are working as many, if not more hours as we used to. And it hasn't freed us, from hard work on some level. And despite, being at the sort of tail end of, let's say, 15, 20 years of the last round of digital transformation, we still have job shortages in all sorts of places, albeit some interesting economic impact of that stuff. So I think we're likely to see something very similar. I do think you'll see a continued change in what types of job exist. People used to write things down and erase things from and sum things up in ledgers. And then someone invented the spreadsheet, and those jobs completely went away over the course of about a decade. And then in their place, the analyst role popped up, and the sort of line in the growth of that job literally mirrored the decline in the number of bookkeepers. And I think you'll start to see something very similar, which is to say that there will be jobs where AI automates a very specific set of tasks that we have to do. And one thing we will have to pay a lot of attention to is, how do we help manage people through that? If you've done the same thing every day for 15 years, it's not just as simple as, clicking on a learning module and finding something new to do. And so a big part of how the transformation will occur that AI offers is as much the people, processes, and support for, skill-based careers and the evolution of careers, with regard to skills that kind of get clustered into roles, that get clustered into jobs. That started to change, in a big way over the last decade. And I think we'll see an acceleration of that. So I don't expect that AI will result in a major change in labor and an acceleration of some of the things that we've seen. But I think it's much more likely that we see more things for people to do rather than less over the next 5 to 10 years. But again, I think my experience of how that stuff has played out is it's not like, we go home on a Friday and then on Monday we don't need tellers anymore. It's even the rapid versions of those processes take months, if not years. And so, and part of the planning that needs to go into all of that occurring is, what is the impact on the people that we have doing that stuff, and what else do we need them to do? Because I do think that the sort of cliche around once people are freed up from having to do very rote, very mechanical, very repetitive skills, there's lots of other things that we need to get onto that require the capabilities that humans have that machines don't yet have, and probably, really won't, even if the machines are getting more clever and more intelligent.
Sales type roles, commercial roles, negotiation, those type of things, surely they're impossible to automate, aren't they? But if you're doing some sort of process orientated role, then I think you're probably at risk, aren't you? Because the team of 10 can probably now be replaced with a team of 3, if that makes sense, which is quite scary. But I mean, again, I think, as always, history shows that new jobs, new ways to contribute to the collective will emerge, I'm sure. So are you seeing any macro changes at KPMG at the moment? Obviously, you've got a large client base. Are you seeing any shifts already? Because this is still really early days, isn't it? It's we're not really seeing AI being adopted by organizations and employers too much just yet. But I think that's going to change in 2024 and even more so in 2025, I'm sure. But are you already seeing macro trends emerge here, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're seeing relatively fast adoption of this current generation of AI technologies, but particularly in areas that have a couple characteristics. One is that require assiduousness, which is a very sort of 10-pound word, which fundamentally just kind of means quality repetition, and that are relatively insulated from the litigation that's occurring around the intellectual property disputes, which are still very much in progress around the creation of the large language models and their siblings in generative AI. And for example, we've seen really strong and really rapid demand for the use of generative AI and a set of other AI technologies in areas of risk. not all risk problems are exactly the same, but fundamentally, in certain parts of it, you get external risk, which is usually sort of described, officially in some type of law, which then a corporate entity has to describe as a policy, sets up some controls, needs to test things to see if they meet the controls, and then usually have some sort of quality assurance process. And that kind of 6-step process turns out to lend itself incredibly well to enhancement and automation via the use of generative AI. And partly because we've been working on that for close to a decade, we've seen the sort of acceleration that occurs as a result of generative AI relatively intense, because I think that is an area where there's lots of mechanical processes which are done by people, and there's lots of really complex things to think about with regard to what's our actual risk position, what are the external changes in markets and regulation and the world, the climate, et cetera, where people would be much better off if they were redeployed to think about those fundamental risks if they didn't have to just process the day-to-day work of risks. That's one area that we've seen quite a lot of.
Okay, that's interesting.
The other thing we've seen significant progress and interest around is the use of AI to support people processes, i.e. the HR function. And again, it's a simple set of use cases, but it's just more about taking advantage of the conversational, the very human kind of appearance that generative AI has to help translate between the sort of real life questions that we have when we have a question for HR and the sort of kind of complex and technical environment that actually is the day-to-day existence of HR professionals. And so again, you have a set of policies and procedures and rules for parental leave or holiday or being able to buy or trade holiday days for compensation or all this other complex stuff, which you need very detailed processes for. But when I run into a situation where I actually want to access that, it's not because I'm thinking about it in policy terms. It's because my, partner just said to me, what if we took 3 weeks off next August instead of 2 weeks or something like that? And I need to sort of figure out if that's even possible or what I would need to do. Is there a form to fill out? And so that translation capability between a complex corpus of information and real life is something that it turns out there's a lot of demand for, and it's easy to start to deploy. There's a number of areas which have already kind of taken flight, and then a whole other set of others which are actually the use of AI in implementing technology, the sort of turning the technology back on itself, so AI can be incredibly useful in configuring an ERP system or in testing something. And that's an area where I think there's a lot more work to do to make sure it works, because you can't just, kind of ask the AI to implement your SAP platform and assume that it must have done everything right because it kind of looks like it works. You have to be very careful about that. But that's an area where I think very quickly we'll start to see some major change in the work that we do.
Absolutely. Can I ask you, in terms of the macro stuff as well, is the impact of AI, especially on things like jobs, is it consistent globally, do you think, or are there regional variations? Are we seeing more macro change and AI adoption in, say, Western economies like the US, the UK, Europe, etc., or is this more of a global thing, or is the West behind the curve, and is China and Japan and places like that, are they further ahead? Are you seeing any sort of global inconsistencies at all, or is this just consistent across the globe?
I mean, on the one hand, we're seeing examples of extremely rapid progress in every region of the world. I'm giving a presentation tomorrow with some case studies, and one of them's from Germany, one of them's from Malaysia, one of them's from Brazil, and one of them's from the United States, of some real work that's going on right now. So I don't think it's the case that there's some specific part of the world that's significantly behind. I do think, though, that specific geographies and the corporations that are in that geography and the citizens and people and workers and consumers and individuals that are in those places to some extent depend on other technologies having been deployed for relatively rapid progress to be made. So where we are seeing the most dramatic transformations most quickly are with clients of ours that have made significant progress in the deployment of cloud technologies, for example. And there is a significant gap. There are countries in the world where most companies haven't deployed modern cloud environments. It's not the only requirement. You can deploy an AI on a computer in your closet or under your desk or whatever. But the ability to sort of project the level of automation and intelligence those models are capable of across an organization depends to some extent on its ability to project itself across a network. And so I do think that it puts pressure less on the sort of the AI or specifically generative AI as technology, because the reality is it's much easier to use, it's much more democratic, it's much easier to access, there's open source versions of it. But actually on all of the technical infrastructure that we've been working on for, the better part of 10, 15, 20 years, whether it's data infrastructure or cloud infrastructure or network infrastructure. And I do think you will end up with to some degree, a sort of haves and have-nots phenomenon. I do think ultimately, though, the next 3 or 4 years are going to be interesting, because I think I do think the technology can be so transformative so quickly that you will start to get adversarial situations. And so if you could start to use AI in a contact center and get a customer experience that was, radically improved and different, a productivity injection, that is, again, in the order of magnitude of 20%, then that's going to be material in the performance and reputation of the companies that adopt it more quickly. And it's going to be material enough that those that are even just a little bit behind will appear to be more behind in terms of performance and in terms of customer experience than we've experienced, I think, ever on some level. And so the phenomenon of fast following will, on some level, be much higher stakes, which is to say that the fast followers, and there's most companies will be following in some respects, are going to have to follow pretty quickly to keep up, simply from a customer and or shareholder point of view.
Yeah, the pace of change is crazy at the moment, isn't it? What products have you got your eye on at the moment, Paul? Obviously, Copilot's just come out. Google have released a new one. Elon Musk has released a new large language model. Is it Grok? Any products that have caught your eye that you really sort of keeping an eye on right now that you think are going to have a significant impact on this space?
I mean, as we've said in public, we've got very close relationships with the hyperscalers, i.e. in particular Microsoft and Google. There's also a set of smaller companies, which I won't kind of call out by name, but there's some interesting small companies that are working on, really interesting niche problems. One area that we think there's a lot of potential for example, is in the area of code migration, which again is not a very cocktail party interesting topic, but the kind of COBOL cowboys problem, i.e., companies and governments still have massive, 45-year-old code bases running something really important, and there's 3 people that know how to read it and keep it alive.
The entire banking system being a case in point.
Exactly. So the potential for a technology that could finally unlock us from that massive legacy of incredibly well built, but really disturbingly old code is really interesting. And there's some small companies that have specialized in the use of generative AI to help these algorithms learn how to speak COBOL, in essence, and then translate it into something more sustainable and useful, like low code. So there's areas like that. There's a tremendous amount of innovation going on from smaller companies. But equally, there's AI capabilities popping up across, every platform that people use for everything. So the CRM platforms that we work with for Microsoft and Salesforce, already have the capabilities in them. Platforms like ServiceNow have started to deploy AI capabilities. So one of the challenges I think we have been starting to help clients with is, how do you navigate? How does your AI strategy adapt to the fact that AI is not, unlike, identity and access management? Well, sort of like identity and access management, it is both a platform capability and a feature of essentially every piece of software in existence. And so how do you balance between having an enterprise strategy for that and just recognizing that this is now going to be pushed into every corner of every technical platform under the sun?
Yeah. Use cases of generative AI. 2-part question. What are you most excited about? And what do you think we need to keep an eye on because it could get out of control? So most excited about, most, let's say, fearful of.
I'll answer the question about AI use cases by not answering it, which is to say, I think we are going to look back in 6 months and start to talk about, as a large group of people, the fact that nobody is going to use case their way to the future. By which I mean, use cases are incredibly useful, not just because of the coincidence of the word use, in helping understand where you might start to deploy artificial intelligence. But fundamentally, I think the real value comes from looking at sort of an end-to-end process in an organization. And you could use the phrase value stream for that. There's lots of phrases that you could use, and thinking not just about what are a few points in that, i.e. some use cases where I could deploy AI to, read a purchase order and, write the data into a, location that's more useful so that I don't have to have people sifting through them. But how do I rethink completely an end-to-end process of procurement or a significant chunk of my supply chain or something like that? And so I think there are areas of transformation which are the biggest sort of pain points that we all still have. I think a lot of the back and middle office, where we have extremely complex and cumbersome processes that restrict the agility of our business models are the areas that we will see significant change. And those are, for example, in the areas of supply chain and procurement, which ultimately are a bottleneck for product innovation. If I've got to rework my supply chain every time I pivot to some set of parts that I don't quite know how to get in a large enough group, it's a constraint on my business model. And I think AI will be deployed to ultimately kind of free us from those constraints. I do think that AI's application in the areas of risk, in detecting fraud, in enforcing regulation, we've seen dramatic improvement. And I think the area in terms of use cases that make me pause a little bit, again, I would answer it in a general way. I mean, the thinking about the ethics of AI and the way in which AI can be deployed in a sort of trusted manner is absolutely essential to successfully deploying this stuff. Yeah. It just so happens that I think some of the best use cases are areas where the ethical questions are not irrelevant, but are relatively easy to answer. If you're going to use AI to automate your end of quarter close process, there's less ethical questions than if you're going to use it to hire someone, for example. Sure. But I think the areas like the use of AI in hiring decisions, the use of AI in credit decisions, the use of AI in any kind of customer recommendations or interactions present some interesting ethical challenges, which on the one hand are very human. On some level, the only thing it takes for us to make sure the AI is making ethical decisions is for us to define what an ethical outcome looks like and tell the AI to stay within those boundaries. On the other hand, that puts intense pressure on us as a group of people to define what's an ethical outcome, which can be complicated, particularly in this day and age where you've got all kinds of opinions on things, certainly from a political and social point of view. So I think the general category of ethical AI is going to put quite a bit of pressure on people to have conversations about what are ethical outcomes, and then we just need to implement it on some level.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Are you suggesting that the ethical side of it should be regulated more, Paul, or are you suggesting that it's just about responsibility of the technology firms who create these large language models and this AI capability to regulate it themselves? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think there are two types of regulation in flight. One is comes out of the most recent round of announcements, which are putting pressure on the companies that develop the models, the foundation models themselves. And that's largely around, I would say, kind of major impact use cases, i.e. the use of AI in developing drugs, to make sure that it's, not as easy to develop a bioweapon with the next generation of these models, for example. And those are things that are, true national security risks and that you can go into a lab and test to make sure we understand what we're doing before we make these the next round of these models publicly available. And I think it makes a ton of sense to do that. There's a whole nother round of regulation, which I don't think is possible to replicate in a lab. So the 900 different things that you could use AI to do in a finance department are not productively simulated in a lab, before we release GPT-5 or something like that. They are going to be tested in practice in the same way that banks and life sciences companies and consumer companies do it, which is by partnering with regulators to create transparency around the use of new technology to do automation. And I think that the direction of travel in the UK and the EU and most other places is that kind of context-specific regulation. And I think that's just going to unfold the way much regulation has, and hopefully learning lessons from some of that regulation, such as GDPR, to make sure there's a much tighter partnership between the commercial and other entities that are finding things to do with this technology and the regulatory point of view on what is acceptable and unacceptable, or more to the point, what are the steps that you need to take in order to do that in a safe way, which is probably more more what regulation in most of the sort of commercial use cases of AI is going to entail.
You would make a very good politician, Paul. Your answers are very, very slick. I gotta be honest with you. That's a really good answer. This is the question we typically ask at the end of every interview. Looking back at your career now, and you've got a long way to go, I'm sure, Paul, you're still a young man. What career advice would you give to your 21-year-old self, knowing what you know now?
So I have a statistical answer because I've done analytics projects on this question, and a kind of philosophical answer. The statistical answer is every time we've done an analytics project to try to determine what makes the most effective employee at a company, the number one most predictive thing is pointless networking, by which I mean not networking that's designed to generate some sort of outcome or to build a network, but literally just going and talking to lots of people. And on some level, the less follow-up, the better. And literally every time we've looked at it, whether it's in a lab environment, a sales environment, a corporate environment, a government environment, we found that the people who are most successful 18 months later are the people that are highly, highly actively engaged in talking to other people. So I don't think my 21-year-old self needed that advice because I just went around in a slightly naive way talking to everybody who would listen to me, trying to learn things. But that piece of advice is statistically the most accurate one. And I think that, the thing I probably spent more time over the course of my career worrying whether I'd made the right decisions. I think it's quite difficult to know whether you've made the right decision. Certainly when I got involved in AI 25 years ago, I wasn't too concerned about whether it would be the right decision, but there's literally no way I could have predicted what's happened over the last year. It turns out to have been a good career decision, but I would emphasize to myself that you should just pursue things that you're interested in. Surround yourself with people you like to work with, and that's fundamentally the important things. And look for opportunities to be of service fundamentally, because at the end of the day, that's what's important.
100%. No, that's brilliant advice, Paul. So 3 quick fire questions. Number one piece of productivity advice.
Well, my number one piece of productivity advice is one that I literally never listened to myself, which is to make a list and keep it short and get through the list. I have a tendency to make a list and then just keep adding things to it and then make a new list the following day and deal with the records.
And end in the day with a really big list.
But yeah, I think making a list is just about being realistic and focused about what you can actually accomplish, which for someone like me who gets very, very interested in things can be, and who wants to be helpful, can be a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Okay.
That's an interesting one. So my answer in my college application for who would be my ideal roommate was Otto von Bismarck, mainly because he seemed like he'd be an interesting person. He is no longer in the world.
Otto von Bismarck's an interesting one. I did a history degree, so I actually know a little bit about Otto von Bismarck. So yeah, that is
seemed like a fascinating guy to share a room with, but.
Absolutely. So books, are you much of a reader? What book have you been inspired by recently?
It's a good question. I am much of a reader. I've got a 2-year-old, so I haven't had as much time to read recently as I would like. And I'm also, because I've got a 2-year-old, not sleeping enough. And so all proper nouns have been purged from my head. But one book that I've read recently, I'm not going to remember the name, but it was a book written by a woman, actually published somewhat posthumously. So it should be easy for people to Google, on systems theory. And I found it incredibly useful in the context of everything we've talked about, and just, trying to be a good leader to think about how little parts of lots of different things in the work that we do interact with each other to add up to something more complex. And, when things break down, it can be something, non-obvious and downstream from that. So I've been reading a little bit about systems theory as a stimulation of another way to look at the same things that I look at every day.
Well, look, Paul, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. I think we've covered some fascinating ground here. Where can people find you? Where are you active? What platforms are you active on? Find out what you guys are doing.
I think the main platform I'm active on in terms of all this stuff is LinkedIn, and I'm easy to find there. I don't know what my handle is, but it's just Paul Henninger at KPMG. I still consume information from the various other social media platforms, but I'm more of a listener than a participant in the increasingly turgid conversations on all the other ones.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree. Paul, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for coming on the Tech Leaders podcast.
Great to talk to you. Thanks.
Great conversation. Really enjoyed chatting to Paul. It's really good talking to somebody who's been involved in AI since pretty much its inception, so from the very early days, and has seen it evolve into this explosion of mainstream adoption since the release of ChatGPT 3.5, which is actually just coming up to a 1-year anniversary, actually. We discussed, obviously, so many massive talking points that we could have elaborated on so much. Macro trends and the regional element of that, the global adoption of AI productization, ethical AI, and we didn't scratch the surface on that, but that was really interesting to get Paul's thoughts on that. But the thing that really stood out for me was the conversation that we had around job displacement as a result of AI. I think Paul's bullish and optimistic view on that point was quite reassuring for me. And I think, history does indeed show, as Paul quite rightly pointed out, that when new technology emerges, there is definitely a knock-on effect to the labor market. But what then generally happens is new jobs get created and things just move on, So there is no real evidence to suggest that that is not the case here. And I'm really hopeful that Paul is right on that point. But I thought, there was obviously a lot more to it. I thought there was some really interesting points he made to back that up. But I think that was really something that stood out for me. Again, so much to choose from. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're reassured by it. I think this episode was a bit of an eye-opener for me in a couple of ways. So I really hope that you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed doing it. Thank you for downloading.